Thank you so much for being with us. Now I would like to give the floor to the first European Commission Coordinator on Combating Anti-Semitism, Katharina von Schnurbein. We are very happy to welcome you again after you gave an impressive and moving speech at ELNET's annual International Policy Conference last November. As mentioned, we hopefully will have one in 2021 again. This was as part of our joint initiatives to help put the item of anti-Semitism on top of Europe's priority list. The fact that the European Union has appointed you in 2015 as the first ever European Commission coordinator on combating anti-Semitism is a landmark decision, but it also underlines the pressing necessity of your work following the very worrying developments we have been witnessing in the EU. Before being appointed as the European Commission Coordinator on Combating Anti-Semitism, you worked for 5 years as an advisor to EU President José Manuel Barroso on the dialogue with religious and non-confessional organizations. You started working for the European Commission in 2002 as a press officer for the EU delegation in Prague. With the enlargement in 2004, you moved to Brussels as spokesperson for the Czech EU Commissioner Vladimír Špidla. A lot of experience in Brussels and in the EU, and while you have been the Commissioner on Combating Anti-Semitism, we have really come to know you as a true partner of the Jewish people in Europe, who works around the clock to combat anti-Semitism wherever it occurs and helps building bridges between the European member states together with your colleagues. And of course also enhancing the many projects to promote Jewish life and protect the Jewish people in Europe when it's needed. Therefore, it's needless to say that we are very honored to have you here with us, and ELNET is looking forward and very committed to continue working together with you closely in the future. To start our conversation on the topic of today, Between Hope and Fear, the future of Jewish communities in Europe, I would like to start by asking you the following question. Could you maybe describe the threat of anti-Semitism, including its new forms, that you are currently seeing in Europe? Please, Katharina, if we can start with that.
Yeah, dear Matthijs, Jean-David, Avi, David, and also Felix Klein, my very good and close colleague. And also Marian Turski, it's an honor to have you here. I've quoted you a lot of times on the 11th commandment that you said you brought back from Auschwitz, thou shalt not be indifferent. I think this also in a way has become my personal motto in a driver in this fight against anti-Semitism. So it's a real pleasure to be with you again and to share my thoughts on what can be done, how the situation is, but then also to listen and to hear from you where you think progress can be made and what also the EU, in your views, could push more. Now, of course, we see, and I think in a way, given that it's a global pandemic, we have all been in a similar or the same boat when it comes to seeing how with the Corona pandemic, we've also seen an infodemic. There has been a lot of conspiracy myths related to false information about the Jewish community in particular as well, with regards to the Jewish community creating a virus and then now making money by trying to come up with a vaccine, and maybe they're not going to share the vaccine because they want to keep it for themselves. So this kind of very vile conspiracy is something that we've seen increasingly, and that is very worrying. Why? Because we know that the road from conspiracy myths in the past has been very short to hateful acts. And this is why we at the European Commission now think that we have to come up with a more holistic view with regards to the prevention of radicalization, hate speech, and also tackling conspiracy myths, which is in a way more difficult because while in Europe hate speech, when inciting to hatred and violence is illegal, conspiracy is not something that is necessarily illegal. So the way to address it has to be much smarter. And I'm happy to discuss this maybe at a later stage. We see that anti-Semitism has been on the rise, and we know this also, unfortunately, with regards to figures. In some countries, there are 5 recorded incidents per day against the Jewish community. And given that overall, the Jewish community is far less than 1% of the population, this is enormous. And in some countries, more than 40% of racist acts go against the Jewish community. So there is an enormous challenge. We know that some of it is due also to better reporting, because we do encourage the Jewish community to actually report incidents, because only if we make it visible, we will also be able to tackle it. But there is an element also of the watersheds being opened, and people are much more outspoken about their anti-Semitic thoughts, and in a way also the attacks from the right-wing extremist side, but also from the left and from the extreme Islamist side have increased in different ways. So I think it's a difficult situation, and maybe the biggest challenge is that a lot has been done, and some of it has been mentioned already also by Jean-David with regards to state action and also action on European level. But we do not see yet a lot of progress when it comes to the Jewish community feeling safer, and these measures actually taking positive root. And so this will be the challenge now also of this new commission under President von der Leyen, who has placed this very high on the agenda. In fact, in the first 10 days of her mandate, she already gave a speech which was called After Halle, From Words to Action, where she announced that this bigger challenge now also needs bigger action. And so we have a very significant support from her side. Maybe so much as a start.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. I think for our listeners from Europe, but also for our listeners from the US, could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on what exactly is your role at the European Commission, and what kind of projects you are developing, and what kind of things in a practical way is it that you and your team are doing?
Sure. So my role is, on the one side, to liaise closely with the Jewish communities, to really listen to their concerns and to report those concerns to the political level, to the commissioners. It's currently Vice President Skinas is responsible for the fight on anti-Semitism on the political level, and then to make policy recommendations in a holistic way. So ranging from tackling hate speech online, to education, to security, to liaise closely with the different departments within the Commission, and make sure that that the fight against anti-Semitism becomes part of those policies as well. And the specific need also with regards to the Jewish community. For example, we know that security is the issue #1 at the moment, which is understandable. Because if you have to think, can I get out of this metro station, or do I take the next because the neighborhood is safer for me? That, of course, is a big challenge. The same for the schools and for synagogues and so on. So one aspect has been to bring member states within the European Council together to support the adoption of a declaration on anti-Semitism and the security of Jewish premises, where the member states by unanimity agreed to 17 different actions that now have to be let's say, transposed into concrete actions. And those actions range from the security to the adoption of the IRA definition to, in particular, very importantly, the adoption also of national strategies against anti-Semitism. And as we know that security is such an important part of this, we have at the European Commission now also launched funding in support of the member states and the and places of worship to ensure that security measures can be supported by European taxpayers. So, you know, it's on the one side, it's the strategic development, but then it also goes down to concrete programs and funding and working closely together with the member states, because some of the responsibilities, in particular, for example, also security, but also education, are in the competence and the responsibility of the individual member states. And that means we have to convince them, we have to support them, we have to provide them with best practices, with instruments that they can then use in order to create a safer space for the Jewish community than in the local environment.
Thank you. You mentioned before already that you have the impression, if I understood well, that because of the social media and the various platforms, it's much easier for people to utter all sorts of conspiracy theories and blunt anti-Semitism. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit, when you look at Europe in particular, what is, in your opinion, the root cause of anti-Semitism here? Is it still the old anti-Semitism that we have seen since a very, very long time ago? Or is there also predominantly a new kind of anti-Semitism that we are seeing that is becoming a larger part of what we are experiencing?
I believe we see in Europe of all different kinds of anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, over history, the old anti-Semitism has always only been added on with new forms rather than, you know, leaving behind the old forms. But it depends a bit geographically. I think that in Western Europe, we see more, for example, of anti-Zionism. And well, if I don't want to generalize too much, but more of the maybe traditional racist ideas can be found in Eastern Europe. And then we have, of course, the big chunk of conspiracy myths that go back many centuries, but in particular also the 19th century, and that reaches far, not only the fringes, but far really into the mainstream of society, which is very worrying. And then you have from the Islamist extremist side a mix of the right-wing ideas of Holocaust denial and distortion and anti-Semitism related to Israel. So all of this together is I think you know, a big challenge that has to be tackled in different ways. But we have always been very clear at the Commission that all forms of anti-Semitism are equally pernicious and therefore need to be attacked.
Thank you. What do you think, looking at the EU as of course, a country with its own culture, its own history, is really the key in fighting anti-Semitism in these 27 member states in this continent? Do you think there's a special approach that differs from other parts of the world?
In Europe, you mean?
Yes.
Well, yes, to some extent. I mean, the most important issue is that that Europe has seen the Holocaust, and this tragedy was part of creating the European Union, and to say never again. And we have to make sure that never again is indeed never again. And it, as we know, it doesn't start with the atrocities. It starts with words. It starts, you know, as we see to some extent at the moment, these conspiracy theories again resurfacing bluntly, and this is where we need to counteract, and we need to do it on a constant basis, individually. I think that every citizen has also a responsibility there, but then also with necessary legislation and in framing, for example, of the platforms, because a lot of it is happening online. So I think the specific responsibility that comes from the Shoah is something that Europe must always remain conscious of, and that also means that we have to make sure that our young people know about the Holocaust, they understand as much as it is understandable, the dimension of it and the relevance to humanity. And all of this needs to be taught, needs to be addressed. That means you need to train the teachers who are being trained. Not only the history teachers in university should learn about the Holocaust, but in order to recognize an anti-Semitic remark, one also has to understand that you know, the sports teacher needs to know what it needs to recognize it in the school square. So all of that, I think, together is a big responsibility. I don't want to say that education on the Holocaust is less important elsewhere, but in Europe, it's particularly important. And that then, of course, also includes our responsibility towards the Holocaust survivors and their families in the second and third generation, who also have a very special role to play when it comes to explaining and giving also their very personal, often very personal and impressive testimonies of how this has impacted their lives.
Just before we go over to the second part with questions also by the participants of this event, let me just finish by two final questions that I would like to ask you as a follow-up to what you just mentioned. If you look at the European Union, we already mentioned Dr. Felix Klein. Is there a lot of cooperation between the other people from European governments who are involved on fighting anti-Semitism? And do you think the system, the European government system, legal system, is used sufficiently, or should there also be a more participation of by the community, European communities?
So you mean the European Jewish communities, or which communities?
Yeah, or the Jewish, the European Christian communities, or
okay.
non-religious communities.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe to answer your last question first, I believe that we have created follow-up to this declaration that I mentioned, where the member states committed to writing and drafting, adopting national strategies on anti-Semitism, where we help them in these different fields that I've mentioned, from security to education to the IRA definition and different other fields, with the implementation and the preparation of these national strategies. And in a way, it's a unique format, because into this working group, where we have 2 representatives from each of the 27 member states, we also invite from each member state the representative of the Jewish community. And then we divide after each panel, we give time to, as we call it, discussions under 6 eyes, where the member states representatives speak with the Jewish community about the specific issues that there are. We're starting from, risk analysis with regards to the security, but also curricula and training for teachers. Each country has different challenges and has different answers, and it's important to provide this space between the Jewish community and the state authorities. And much to my surprise, after the first meeting we had last June on security, I had a few countries that came up afterwards and said they had more time in Brussels with their state authorities in the context of this meeting than they ever had at home. So I think it's very important to make sure that the Jewish community and state authorities are closely connected. And of course, this is very different. In some countries, it works very well, and in others, there's not much interaction yet. And then, of course, having non-Jewish voices has always been very important. And I think that it remains key to make sure that there is standing up for each other of different groups. Doesn't have to be only interreligious. It can also be different other groups that simply stand up for each other, like we see at the moment a lot of support for Black Lives Matter in the US from different groups. And I think it's important to understand that any form of racism and also anti-Semitism is simply unacceptable. And your first question was, sorry.
About the coordination between
yes.
other colleagues.
Yes, we have a very close coordination. Not all member states have already appointed special envoys, but all member states have identified a person somewhere, and it ranges from, on the one side, state secretaries to heads of units that take care of the fight against anti-Semitism in the context of the administration. We gather twice a year, and we just actually had a recent meeting specifically dedicated to COVID and anti-Semitism online. And we really try to tackle the issues that are of relevance at the moment, and then very importantly exchange best practices so we don't all reinvent the wheel. Of course, the situation is different in each member state, and in Europe we're very aware of the fact that the systems are also very different between the French presidential system and the German federal system. There is a big governance difference, but we know that when it comes, for example, to education tools, to security also, that actually we can learn a lot from each other. So this collaboration has really been crucial, and we think therefore that it is very important that each member state appoints a special envoy, and we also advocate that with regards to the member states, in order also for the Jewish community to have one entry point into the administration.